Hello, today we're going to be discussing and talking about plot. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the different standard elements of a plot in a story. So a plot is used to tell a story. It's the sequence of events in a story. All stories absolutely, without a doubt, must have a plot. If there's no plot, there's no story. Let's talk about the elements of plot. All plots have standard elements. These standard elements almost always happen in the same sequence. Otherwise, the plot doesn't make sense. So there's always a beginning, there's always a rising action, there's always a climax, there's always falling action, and there's ultimately always some sort of resolution. So let's talk about each of those things I just talked about. The elements of a plot. The very first one that you need to be aware of is exposition. Now, exposition is just a fancy way of saying the beginning of the story. This is where we are introduced to the characters and we learn about our setting, the time and place that the story is taking place. The next thing that we have is going to be the rising action. This is where we learn about what the conflict is, and the story becomes more complicated. This is what kind of draws you into the story. It makes you want to keep watching to see what happens next. Then we have the climax of the story. The climax is the turning point of the story, and this is very crucial to know that it is called the turning point of the story. Because a lot of people will tell you that the climax is the most exciting point of the story. And it might be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's the turning point of the story. It's where something is changing. There's a decision made. The main character has decided how they're going to solve whatever the conflict is. And most of the time, it's the highest point of interest. But always remember, turning point, a decision is made, and we fall into the falling action of the story. Now, falling action is where we're starting to see the actions that are wrapping up the plot. We're bringing the story to some sort of conclusion. Maybe once the turning point took place and the decision was made, the fallen action is the part of the story that brings you to the end. So the conflict begins to get resolved. The events begin to conclude. And resolution is a very important one too, and it's the fifth and final element of plot. This is simply a fancy way of saying it's the end of the story. What happened at the end of the story? Now let's take a look at a short story. Let's complete a plot diagram for the story of Jack and Jill. So everyone kind of knows Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. So let's look at that in terms of maybe a story, more detailed version. It's washing day at the Johnson's house. Jack and Jill's mom asked them to fetch a pail of water. The well is at the top of the hill. They know the pail will be heavy once it's full of water, so they climb the hill together. They arrive at the top of the steep hill out of breath. Jack fetches the water from the bottom of the well. They carefully lift the bucket out of the well and then start down the hill together, each with one hand on the pail. Suddenly, Jack trips. He begins rolling down the hill. Jill, caught off balance, falls and comes tumbling after Jack. They arrive at the bottom of the hill, dazed, confused, bruised, and with no water. They hobble home to tell their mother what just happened. When they arrive home, Mrs. Johnson mends Jack's and Jill's cuts and bruises and then goes up to the hill to fetch the water herself. All right, so let's talk about each portion of the plot line at this point for this story. All right, so we're going to start off with the exposition, or if you'll remember correctly, the beginning of the story. So we learn that it is washing day. We know that Jack and Jill's mom wants them to go get some water. And we know that the water was at the top of the hill. Then the story starts to take off. Jack and Jill are going up the hill together. They're at the top of the hill. They get the water. And they start down the hill together with buckets between them, with the bucket between them. Each one has a hand on the bucket trying to help the other one out. And then we hit the climax, the turning point of the story. Something changes. And that was that Jack falls. Once Jack falls, we have hit the climax of the story. We have hit the high point. We have hit the turning point. Because until this, it was just two kids that were going up to get some water for their mom, and now Jack has fallen down. And we can start looking at that fallen action at that point. We're starting to see things coming to an end, and Jill tumbles after him, or she falls down too. They get to the bottom of the hill, they're bruised, they don't have any water, and we know that they hobbled home. Now, the resolution is just how the story ended. So in this case, Jack and Jill's mom heals their cuts and bruises. Jack and Jill's mom goes up to the hill to get the water herself because of her kids. Now let's take a look at yet another nursery rhyme. So, little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Along came a spider who sat down beside her and frightened Miss Muffet away. Now, let's actually turn that into a story. Miss Muffet was hungry. She had been up for hours cleaning the house for visitors that would be coming to her apartment that evening. It was almost noon when she realized that she hadn't taken the time to eat breakfast yet. Miss Muffet prepared her favorite breakfast, curds and whey. She looked out at the window and saw that it looked beautiful outside. She decided to enjoy her breakfast on the tuffet on her balcony. Miss Muffet sat down and began eating her curds and wheys. Suddenly, a spider crawled across the balcony floor and stopped right next to her tuffet. She screamed, jumped up, and ran into her apartment. Miss Muffet finished her breakfast at the kitchen table instead of on her balcony. So, that being said, what do you think is the exposition of this story? All right, so we know in the beginning that Miss Muffet has been cleaning her apartment, and she hasn't eaten breakfast. And then we're introduced to some rising actions. What do you think that might be? Well, we know that Miss Muffet decides to make herself breakfast. Miss Muffet looks out the window, and because it looks beautiful outside, she wants to go eat her breakfast on her balcony. And then she sits down on her tuffet to enjoy her breakfast. And that is our rising action. And it's okay if you didn't get every single one of these. If you got one or two, that's great. Then what do you think is the climax? Where is the turning point? That's right. Along comes the spider. That's what changed everything, right? What happens after she sees the spider? How does she react? She screams, she jumps up and runs inside, right? And what do you think we should put as the resolution of the story? How did the story end? Miss Muffet finishes her breakfast inside at the kitchen table. So hopefully after looking at this, you guys are able to continue through to the next activity. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.